Coming up on today's episode of MycoLogic.
What is a domain? So can you define domain for me?
Well, domain is just a location. So think of it as a location that we're measuring. So in a home, we have three areas that we may measure that indoor environment that each answers a different question. So the airborne domain, if the concern is, are we being exposed to something? We're going to measure the air. If I want to know the history of a home, I'm going to measure the dust because it gives me some history of what's happened in the home. If I want to know whether there's localized contamination, I'm going to measure the surface. So they're just different areas that we're measuring to give us data to answer different questions. And they're not the same question, they're different questions. And so you and I talk over and over again. It all starts with the question we're trying to answer.
Hi, welcome back to MycoLogic. I'm Andi Hembroff.
And I'm Mark Ritacco.
We really appreciate all of you who have subscribed, reached out. We've gained some really, really wonderful feedback, and we're so grateful. We've also gotten some feedback on some upcoming topics that we're going to be covering in future episodes. So thank you for engaging us and supporting us. Today, we're going to be talking about domains. And this is often where a lot of confusion comes in when folks are choosing which test to take for their home and how to interpret these things. And so domains are essentially where some of these contaminants can exist within the built environment. However, before we dive into today's topic, Mark, I think it would be wise to cover what we talked about in episode 1 and 2.
Yeah, I think it's a great starting point, Andy. And again, I want to thank everybody for, all the wonderful comments, the emails supporting the information that we're providing. So thank you very much for that. The exposure framework was created to help organize environmental findings into a set of simple questions. And the goal is not to tell people, what conclusions to reach. The goal is just to make sure that everybody is answering the same question. So you have homeowners, clinicians, environmental professionals, remediation contractors. They're all looking at the same home, but they all are providing valuable information, but sometimes that information is not answering the same question. So the framework organizes the environmental findings into logical sequence of questions. What is it, which we talked about in episode 1? Are we breathing it, which we talked about in episode 2? Today, where is it, the domains? And then we'll get into later on in episodes, is it happening now? And is the problem resolved? So each question builds on the previous one as far as the framework goes. So in episode 1, what did we talk about? We talked about the hazard. What is it? Why is that important? Because that's the original question that we're trying to evaluate. And that's where everything starts in the indoor environment is what are we trying to understand? So that's episode 1. Episode 2, we talked about the exposure route. All right. Are we breathing it? Because without a substance in the home, if it doesn't leave where it's located and reach the indoor air, then we're not being exposed to it as far as an inhalation exposure. So those are the first 2 episodes that we worked.
And they were great episodes and so interesting. So thank you for all the work that you're doing, Mark, for families like my own. I want to talk about misalignment a little bit because this is something you and I talk about a lot, Mark. And because when families like mine are sick, we have big questions that need answering. And as you and I talk about so often, different tests answer different questions. Can you build on that a little bit more?
Well, and that's expected actually, because people have to understand that when you're doing an environmental investigation, you're basically looking at different locations. All right, where is it inside the home? So when you're looking at the domains inside a home, we have the air, okay, what we're breathing. You have the dust reservoir, what has settled out of the air over time, more historical. And then you have surface domain. Where is the contaminant located? Is it there on either surfaces or material or content? So those are the 3 areas that we're looking at inside the indoor environment. And each one of those domains is evaluating something completely different. We're not
Right.
looking at the same thing on each location to give us information, but they're not necessarily designed to align with the other domains.
Agreed. And I think a lot of folks assume that diagnosing the built environment is so simple and straightforward because it's an inanimate object. And you and I know that there's more to it than that. And considering the three domains, in other words, the three places that mold and mycotoxins can persist in the environment, is one example. We work with a lot of industrial hygienists, and you have some great analogies that might help folks understand this. Can you build on that for me?
Well, I think a real simple analysis is you go to your doctor's office, and when they're, examining you, they'll look at their chart to see what your blood pressure may be, but that doesn't determine what your blood pressure is today. So today they're
Right.
going to measure what's going on. So when you have the domains, all right, the dust reservoir is kind of like that chart. It's a history of what happened in the environment, but it doesn't tell me what the active exposure is or what's happening right now. So
Right.
we may end up with a, detect in the dust reservoir domain, something that's accumulated, or the airborne domain may be fine currently. All right.
Right.
Either test is wrong. All right. And they're not expected to actually be equivalent, to detect the same thing. So that's where people get confused. We have a positive to test maybe in the dust, but the air comes back normalized. Well,
Right.
which test do I believe is correct? Well, both of them
Right.
are correct. They're just answering different questions. And that's where people get confused. Why aren't
Right.
they the same? Well, they're measuring different things and they're not expected to, have the same result.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important to understand that presence doesn't always equate to exposure. And for somebody like me that was greatly affected by mycotoxins and wants to see change, I think that for us to make the unseen seen, we have to express that exposure and pathway. And the analogy I like to use in that is lead and asbestos. And I know this isn't a perfect analogy, but lead and asbestos can be present within the built environment without exposure. So it's really important to consider that air domain. So Mark, let's talk about, because I know some listeners are like, what are they talking about? What is a domain? So can you define domain for me?
Well, domain is just a location. So think of it as a location that we're measuring. So in a home, we're going to measure, we have three areas that we may measure that indoor environment that each answers a different question. So the airborne domain, if the concern is, are we being exposed to something, we're going to measure the air. If I want to know the history of a home, I'm going to measure the dust because it gives me
Yep.
some history of what's happened in the home. If I want to know whether there's localized contamination, I'm going to measure the surface. So they're just different areas that we're measuring to give us data to answer different questions. And they're not the same question, they're different questions. And so you and I
Right.
talk over and over again. It all starts with the question we're trying to answer.
Amen. All right. I'm going to say it. I'm going to be the devil's advocate. I know some listeners are thinking this. If it's in the dust, couldn't it re-aerosolize? Couldn't it get back in the air?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And we did talk about that in episode 2. So when we're talking about dust, well, where'd the dust come from? It came from the air, right? It's settled over time. And usually what settles over time are the coarse particulates, the heavier particles. Now,
Right.
can they be re-aerosolized? Because that's what people are going to tell. Well, it's in the dust. It can be re-aerosolized. Technically, that's correct. But think of it this way. And I was thinking about a way to explain this to people. You have dust, let's say, on top of a bookshelf. If you run back and forth, in front of that bookshelf, does all that dust aerosolize? No, just a little portion maybe aerosolized. And we look at, particulate counts in the indoor air, the particles that are going to be re-aerosolized are such a small percentage of what's
Sure.
actually currently in the air. And that's where we use that analysis of a particle counter, showing what's the coarse particle size is compared to the fine and ultrafine that can get deep into the lungs. So technically, yeah, they can be re-aerosolized. I think it's a little bit misleading that that's not the majority of exposure that we're going to be looking at for the indoor environment.
And I would say that each of the domains is important to consider. They're all relevant. And I think that's the point that we're also trying to make, is they're all relevant. You and I came up with some analogies this week, and you had one, or we're working on one that really resonated with me, because a lot of us with mold toxicity, we see a lot of doctors. And so help me through this analogy. So we were talking about how we go into the doctor and they're reviewing our medical history. And we touched on this earlier just a moment ago, but let's build on it because it's a good one. So I go into the doctor, they're reviewing my medical history, what has happened in the past, and that's kind of dust. It's historical, and some of it's really relevant, right? What would you say would be the analogy for, say, air and surface sampling in this medical analogy that you're working on?
Yeah, put that on me. I thought you
I'm
were going to
putting
have
you
the
right, yeah,
answer.
I'm putting you on the spot. Yes. Your analogies are much better than mine.
Well, if we stick with the medical, it's going to be, the doctor's going to look at the history. All right. But what's he really want to know? And what do you want? He wants to know what's currently going on with you. So it's the current, physical evaluation that's happening today. What's actually happening today? And air is
Mhm.
telling us what's active today in the breathing zone. And we talked about basically exposure happens in the breathing zone. The primarily
Yep. Yeah.
exposure to mycotoxins is inhalation, all right, in the indoor
Yep.
environment. So it's really what's current. So medical record gives us some data, but we want to know what's currently actively going on, and that's measuring the air or a surface sample to see if that's contamination on the surfaces. So
Right. Well done. Let's talk about the air domain for a little bit, because this is one that is often misunderstood, and it's often one that's minimized, and I think really important. So air sampling, it's a snapshot. And let's talk about that for a minute, because I hear a lot of the folks in these sick communities, they're doing dust sampling. They're really focused on that dust domain, and they kind of set aside the air domain, because some of these air sampling methodologies are missing the issue. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
yeah, and I think it's really important for everybody to understand when a homeowner's been really, really sick. And Andy, you know about this because you've been in this situation,
Yep.
and you're trying to get answers. And it may be months or years that you've been going through this trying to get answers. And finally, a clinician says, let's order a mycotoxin medical test. And it comes back with a detect for a biomarker for mycotoxins. Well, the next question is it my home that I'm having exposure? There are three different methods of exposure:
Right.
ingestion,
Yep.
inhalation, and contact. So the biomarker just says you're exposed. It doesn't tell you whether it's inhalation, ingestion, or dermal, and it doesn't
Right.
tell you a location. So sometimes it's the first answer that a homeowner has that maybe there's something that is answering my concern about my health. And so
Right.
they immediately go, okay, I'm going to evaluate my home. A lot of them will go on to these Facebook toxic mold groups, and the next thing they are being told, well, you need an ERMI, you need an ERMI. And this is where we get into understanding that even though we have three different domains, airborne, dust reservoir, and surface domains, inside of each of those domains, we have tests that answer different questions.
Yep.
So
Yep.
ERMI is answering mold DNA. Okay.
Yep.
It doesn't answer mycotoxin exposure, but there are some mycotoxin dust tests out there that detects whether mycotoxins are in the dust. Same with the air. We have two different types of methods to test the air. One is for biological
Mold
mold
spores.
spores, and the other one is for airborne mycotoxins.
Yep. Very
Same with
different.
surfaces. So
Very different.
we have three different domains that answer different questions. Inside of each of those domains, we have multiple tests that give us additional data. So,
And that's a big topic that we're really going to cover in another episode, because you're right, and it's a big topic, because there are all these different tests within these different domains, and there's nuances there. And you touched on that. Are we looking at mold, biological, or mycotoxins, a chemical? And then the lab analyses, there's nuances there. So we're going to dig into that in another episode.
so back to your original question, so a homeowner orders let's say an ERMI, okay, because a clinician recommended it or the Facebook group recommended
Yep.
it. All right. It's just a data point. And people have to understand that that data point can show maybe a high score that there's mold DNA there that we need to evaluate, or it can be a low score. Neither one's conclusive as to whether or not you're currently having exposure. All right.
Right.
So it's kind of like your medical record. All right. But it's not showing you whether you're healthy right now in front of that doctor. It's not a current exposure method. So, it's really leads to what the next step is. And what I want people to understand, and you know this, Andy, is I don't want to see escalation. All of a sudden you have an ERMI test that shows these mold DNA, and people all of a sudden, anxiety increases, all right, and start making decisions that may not need to be made because I
Yep.
really haven't taken the time to take a step back and follow the sequence of questions in the exposure framework.
I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate you laying that out in your book because I see that a lot. I see people sometimes make inappropriate, expensive decisions based on one data point, really not understanding it. And ERMI, I think where it can be really useful, where I've seen it be wonderful is it's sometimes it can be very validating to a family like mine with a very sick child where they're saying, is it our home, and it can lead them to that next step. But really important to understand these tools, and just because the DNA fragments are there, it doesn't mean that the issue is current. Right, we're assuming that those mold DNA are from actively growing molds, and then we're assuming that those molds are actively producing mycotoxins, and then we're assuming that we're being exposed to them. And sometimes that is the case, but yeah, really, really important to step back. Let's talk about the surface domain because I feel like that one people get confused. I think they think that a surface sample is the same as a dust sample. Can you explain the difference in those two domains?
Yeah, I think it's pretty important to understand the difference. Obviously, dust is something that's accumulated over time. You can actually see it and so forth. But when we do a surface sample, we're actually maybe doing a tape lift sample for biological. So it's actually we're sampling the mold itself to determine what type of mold it is.
Sure.
And a mycotoxin test is swabbing a wall or a content to see if there's contamination. So it's really the surface is more to understand if contamination is on a material inside
Yeah.
the home, where dust is, more of a historical. So it's
Sure.
it's different from that perspective.
I think that's important too, because I know in the first couple times we remediated our house and did everything wrong, we got rid of really a lot of contents that were, sentimental to me. And in hindsight, I look back now and realize that I could have cleaned them. And so surface sampling, in my opinion, is helpful for situations like that where families are faced with these decisions of do we keep it? Can we clean it? And instead of leading with fear, we can, have some solid data points. So that's a great domain to consider. So
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we created it because I've been going through this journey. People have told me that, mycotoxins are on the walls, on the ceilings, on furniture, on content. And if I'm a remediator, which is what I am at heart, it's like, okay, you're telling me it's on these things. What's your proof that that actually is true? Because as a
Right.
remediator, what's my goal? My goal is to identify the location and then make sure that it's been removed and cleaned and then be able to verify that that's been done. So
Right.
I can't assume that this wall over here has mycotoxins on it. I need to validate that. And that's
Right.
where a swab test comes in for
Absolutely.
mycotoxins. But then I
Yep.
also want to make sure that I did my job correctly and the mycotoxins are removed. So I got to test it to make sure it's removed. Now, that's validation up front and at the end. And same
Right.
with the air. I need to be able to verify that I did my job correctly. So I need to verify before that was in the air, and I need to verify afterwards that it's been normalized. And that's important to understand the difference. You can't do that with dust, by the way.
No. No. No, I was gonna lead into that question, but sometimes people don't understand that remediation is objective, and when you come in as a professional and you're saying, okay, this is what I'm going to do for you, this is what you're going to pay me to do, and this is how we're going to confirm that it was done successfully. And those services get very expensive, and so it's good to have tools to say, "Yep, it's here. This needs to be done." And yes, our remediator did this successfully. Mark, you used to tell me about your remediation days and about the white gloves in your van, and which I love. But I hear a lot about dust sampling being used in a post remediation verification setting or a PRV setting. And for listeners listening that don't know what that is testing and inspection that's done post remediation to ensure that the job was done successfully. So can you speak a little bit on the issues with using dust sampling in a PRV setting?
Well, yeah, I don't think dust sampling has a place in mold remediation or mycotoxin remediation. Okay.
Right.
And the reason for that is, one, verification.
Yeah.
There's no way that I can send in a dust sample at the end of a job after I've done my job because what's my job inside that structure is to remove the dust, right? And
Right.
so if I've done my job correctly, there's no dust to send back in, to verify that I did my job correctly. We used to, as you mentioned, we used to have white gloves inside our vans, and the lead tech would basically check afterwards to make sure that there wasn't any dust. And the reason they did that is they knew that we might spot check them to see if there was anything left, because we wanted to make sure that that environment's really, really clean. So I think what's really important more than anything else for homeowners to really understand, number one, what is the hazard? All right. And communicating that effectively to the homeowner. Are we trying to evaluate biological mold investigation? Or are we trying to evaluate a mycotoxin exposure investigation? Or
Mhm.
both? They're
Right.
not the same. And this is where people get confused. And that's why the exposure framework was designed so that everybody was evaluating these environments based on these simple questions to
Right.
organize it. So if you're a homeowner and you have a biomarker from a medical test with mycotoxins, you're concerned about the mycotoxin exposure
Right.
investigation. So when you call up, you want to make sure that the indoor environmental professional understands that that's what you're looking at. You want to look at the home for health issues. Now, they
Mhm.
may need to do an active mold investigation at the same time to
Yeah.
make sure there's not current active mold growth inside that environment. So that's really,
Right.
really, really important. The second part that's really, really important is for the contractor to understand that he's not just doing a mold remediation job, he's also doing a mycotoxin remediation job. They're not the same. They may be related, but they're not the same. So there are different steps if you're trying to eliminate mycotoxin exposure
Yeah.
inside the indoor environment. So again, it's making sure that everybody is addressing the same question. And it all starts with the initial question. What is the
Right.
hazard we're trying to evaluate?
And for anybody that's listening that is a little bit confused, I would encourage anybody to go back and listen to episode 1 where we talk about hazards and the difference between a biological hazard and a chemical hazard. And yes, they are very interconnected. Mycotoxins are rendered by biological organisms, and but the mycotoxins are not alive. And so yes, they're related, but unfortunately, and Mark, this is why I got into the industry. The mold professional, the mold inspector that I hired, who had been doing this for many years, didn't know what mycotoxins were. And I just expected this person to know. And because I was very sick with mycotoxin illness. And so unfortunately, this professional that I hired understood mold allergies, which I don't have. And so really important to understand that there is a difference. Yes, they are connected, but important to understand that difference. So
Yeah, and that's the industry where we're at today, and it's learning and it's growing, and there's more and more
sure it is.
training when it comes to mycotoxin exposure and how to evaluate it, and then also how to remove the mycotoxins from the indoor environment. I do
Right.
want people to understand that when it comes to a mold investigation, people out there are very well trained and they do a great job at that. It's
Yeah.
the mycotoxin exposure investigation. The industry needs to continue to educate on it so that when you, as a homeowner, are requesting that, you have a number of resources to do both. And it's
Right.
coming. The training's going to be there. These professionals out there are very good at what they do. What you don't want to have happen is continue to repeat the same process. You bring out someone to do a mold investigation, do the remediation. You're still not feeling well, so you do another mold investigation. You want to make sure that they understand to do also the mycotoxin exposure investigation along with that.
I'm such a proponent for a diversified sampling plan that considers all three domains and also each of the hazards in regard to mold, biological, mycotoxins. So there is no one perfect test. There is, you have to look at all of these things holistically. And I think you've laid that out really well in your book, Are You Breathing It? And in your exposure framework. So really impactful. And I just want to mention this since we're talking about all these domains. I'm an advocate. I lead with my heart, and I talk to families like my own all over the U.S. and they're desperate. They're seeking answers. And my concern with the dust domain and the testing done in there is that sometimes there's too much emphasis on the dust. And I have seen families spend tens of thousands of dollars cleaning their home. I mean, truly just cleaning. And I say to these families, like, gosh, I bet you felt good for a few days, because who wouldn't? And yep, we felt good. And well, I'm guessing you don't feel good now, because it's kind of a band-aid, a very expensive band-aid. So I think that it's important to understand these three domains and the tests that reside within them, and what can they tell us, what are they not telling us, how do they fit into the bigger picture, and then more appropriately, what's a realistic and impactful step forward. And so we need to be really careful about that in regard to that domain. So
Yeah, I agree. I mean, all of this is just data points to help make an informed decision. All right.
amen.
So we're not going to rush into anything. We're going to take a step back. We have a medical test that shows a biomarker for mycotoxins. Then we want to, find out, is it in my home? If it
Yep.
isn't, we want to rule that out
Yep.
so that you can move on to something else to evaluate. So it's information to, again, go to the next step to make informed decisions and to make sure that everybody is on the same page of what the concern is. And that's, again, the hazard question. So it all starts with, what is the concern that I'm trying to evaluate? And then it follows a logical process moving forward.
Absolutely. And on that topic, it's I think where a lot of folks get further confused, and you address this so well in your book, is they want all these data points to line up. And I understand. I talked with a mother yesterday that has a very sick kiddo, and they found a very particular mycotoxin in the child's body, and she's trying to figure out, well, is it from the food we're feeding him? Is it from a preschool? Is it from the home? And those are really, really important questions. So when you're paying all this money for all these different data points, whether it's somatic or in the home, and they're not lining up, it can be frustrating, and it can make you feel like, oh, well, this test is right and this one's not. Well, it's not that this test is right and this test is wrong, but they're looking at different things, whether they're looking at different hazards, right? Biological, so mold spores or mycotoxins, byproducts, or they're looking at different domains within the built environment. We're taking very complex things and we want them to line up, but unfortunately that's not real life, and I wish it was. It would make things a lot easier, but your book did a really good job of explaining that, and I liked that a lot.
Thank you. It's most importantly for people to understand that these tests are not designed to align. All right. Because they're measuring different things. That's the most important thing to understand about domains. What's in dust, I mean, you may be measuring something that's been there for 5 years. All right. Depending on where you took the sample. So it's not expected to align what's current today in the indoor air. So you can get very different results. It'd be nice if they all align, but that's not reality and that's not expected to
No,
align. So,
no.
understand that. The goal is when you get the data points is what's the next step based on what we found. We found
Yeah,
maybe some exposure in the dust for mycotoxins, but we didn't find any in the indoor air. What's the next step? And
right.
so we'll get into those in later episodes, But again, they're data points to move the process along so that we can make an informed decision for our families.
Amen. I appreciate you have a calmness about you. And anytime I feel stressed out, I just call you because you help me see the big picture. And that's one thing that I really appreciate about the
Well,
work
I've
you
always found that, spending a little bit of time with a homeowner and just educating them will bring down the temperature a little bit of what
yeah,
we're looking at, why we're looking at it, and understanding upfront why these tests may not align. It's not that the tests are wrong, okay? The tests are accurate. It's just that we're
yeah,
measuring different things. And then
yeah,
what's the next step if it comes back positive here or negative here? This is what our
right.
next step is going to be or what our options are. So it's really an education process for a homeowner to understand, based on results, these are the options that we have moving forward. And that's the critical thing that homeowners need to understand. What are our options based on these different data points so that we can make an informed decision for our family?
And that's great because I know
Yeah.
after personally going through it when you're sick and your kids are sick, and then you realize that you have to not just look at your family's health and bodies, but your home, it's really overwhelming. And you get a lot thrown at you and it's hard to see the big picture. And then it just brings a lot of stress and fear. So that is
Well, I mean, let's be honest. You've been sick for maybe years or months or years,
well,
or your kids are sick. I mean, and you want to make sure that you've got a safe home environment. So, yeah, it's going to cause stress because you care about your loved ones. So, I don't want to ever diminish that because I can
no,
understand, that
I know.
anxiety. But I also want people not to just jump to conclusions without, understanding of the evidence and where it leads us. And so,
Right.
again, I did write the book, Are You Breathing It? It's free for people on Amazon Unlimited plan. Pick it up, read it. I've got some great feedback of how much it's helped families already. And so if you have questions, just reach out to us. We're here to help.
And if I can ask a personal favor of our listeners, if what you're hearing on our podcast is helpful, please share this platform. Please subscribe, and if you find the book helpful, please leave Mark a review. I watched him put a lot of heart and a lot of hard work into that, and I know it's going to be really valuable. So
Only
your
5-star
feedback,
reviews.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us today on MycoLogic. We truly appreciate your support. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel. Next week, I'm really excited about this topic. Mark, tell us what we're talking about next week.
Well, next week we're going to actually look at the different tests inside the different domains. So, as we said earlier in the podcast, there are different tests to evaluate mold, and also different tests in each of the domains to evaluate mycotoxins. So, we're going to talk about what those tests are, the data that we can get from those tests, and then how that moves us forward in the investigation to make an informed decision.
It's great. I can't wait. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.